If you're a child in 2005 and were a fan of Nickelodeon, the release of Nicktoons Unite was a monumental occasion. Crossover events had been done before on TV, and Nick was no stranger to crossing over their franchises in sports and party games, but Unite was different. It brought together multiple different franchises to tell a unique story in the video game space. As a kid, this was the coolest thing ever. Technically, this wasn't the first time the Nicktoons had teamed up. I covered Nicktoons Freeze Frame Frenzy quite recently, which is basically a Nicktoons Unite game, but it doesn't seem to be considered part of this series of games for some reason. Unite would be the first in a quadrilogy lasting all the way until 2008, and if we're counting all of the unique handheld versions, there were 11 Nicktoons Unite games in total. It was a damn good time to be a Nickelodeon fan in the mid-2000s. But today, we'll just be looking at the title that started it all. I'm Brandon, and I'll be your captain for this journey through Nickelodeon video game history. First announced in THQ's gigantic info dump that I've mentioned quite a bit recently, Nicktoons Unite would release on October 26, 2005 for home consoles and GBA. However, the Nintendo DS version would be held back a little longer before finally reaching stores on January 10 of the following year. Just like Freeze Frame Frenzy, the title of this game outside of North America leveraged the SpongeBob branding instead of Nicktoons. Every game was known as SpongeBob SquarePants and Friends, followed by the game's subtitle. The final game in the series actually made the name switch for North America too. Both the GBA and DS versions were handled by Climax Studios. It's been a little while since I've reviewed one of their games, but you might remember them from Super Sponge, Ed, Edd and Eddy Jawbreakers if you're a real OG fan of this channel, and Adventure Time Pirates of the Enchiridion. Those games range from awful to okay at best, so it's not too promising to see them pop up and develop such an important title in Nickelodeon video game history. The home console version, which most people probably think of when Nicktoons Unite is brought up, was developed by Blue Tongue Entertainment, an Australian developer who is unfortunately no longer with us thanks to the downfall of THQ. They really rose to fame with the De Blob series, but before that they were responsible for developing the first three Nicktoons Unite home console games, Barnyard and El Tigre. Critically though, none of these games would come close to being as well received as something like De Blob. The home console and DS versions received frustratingly low 5.3 average review scores, while I could only find a single 6 out of 10 review for the GBA version. There are plenty of games that have reviewed way worse over the course of Nickelodeon's video game history, but it is disheartening for such an important title to score so low. And one thing that is important to point out before jumping in is that despite this game hyping itself as the Nicktoons Uniting, it's really just 4 different shows here. The spotlight is only on the 4 franchises on the box: SpongeBob, Danny Phantom, Fairly Odd Parents, and Jimmy Neutron. Perhaps they just wanted the focus to be on currently airing shows. These 4 shows were basically the only Nicktoons that fit a game like this, while also still being on the air in late 2005. Invader Zim and My Life as a Teenage Robot are the 2 that probably received the biggest snub here, but those were kind of cult favourites, so it's not surprising to see them left out. Regardless of their reasoning, it's pretty lackluster considering Freeze Frame Frenzy featured playable characters from 8 shows, and it featured 3 other franchises as NPCs. But hey, it's still a gigantic Nickelodeon crossover, and I'm still insanely excited to be getting my hands on Nicktoons Unite. Nicktoons Unite was doing multiverse stuff way before it was cool. The narrative set up to bring together 4 separate Nick shows dives into the multiverse thanks to Jimmy Neutron's genius inventions. Basically, he creates portals to other dimensions, which Professor Calamitous takes advantage of to recruit Vlad Plasmus, Crocker, and Plankton to form the Syndicate of Evil. And their first plan of action is to create a fucking doomsday device to end the entire world. This is just a tad extreme, and thankfully Jimmy agrees too, so he goes out and he recruits his own super team like we're watching the 2016 NBA Finals. I'm going to assume that this is the story for both other versions, but I imagine the DS and especially the home console version goes much more in depth on the story stuff. Outside of the opening, it's basically all gameplay here in the GBA version. Before even touching on anything else, I've got to talk about the graphics. You get smacked in the face with this as soon as you enter the first level. Climax Studios made the bizarre choice to use pre-rendered sprites for all of the playable characters, and some select enemies too, while everything else is 2D. It creates such a visual clash to the point where it makes you feel like two separate games have been merged into one. I don't think they meant it on purpose, but that kind of feeling does fit with a game dealing with multiverse shenanigans. Maybe this design choice could have worked if the characters only looked like this when outside of their own universe, but even that's a stretch. The characters look awful, and you're probably asking yourself why Climax chose this sort of art style. The answer is cutting costs and saving time. Apparently, according to the cutting room floor, these are taken from the DS version, which is why they look so different from everything else in the game. Climax decided to save a bunch of time and money by just creating one set of characters. Smart, but also makes this game significantly worse than it would be if they just created sprites specifically for this game. I've got no doubt they were under insane time crunch, especially because they were developing the DS version simultaneously, so I won't crucify them too much, but yeah, this game ain't pretty. Thankfully, the gameplay in Nicktoons Unite GBA is serviceable. What we've got is a 2D combat puzzle platformer. The actual platforming here is mostly an afterthought. All the emphasis is put on the combat and puzzles, which is why you end up with a vertical leap that would put NBA players to shame. Also, you come across multiple gaps that you need to jump through, but the window is so tight that you'll be retrying it over and over again until the game just finally lets you through. It becomes pretty obvious that platforming really wasn't Climax's priority. At the beginning of each level, you're asked to pick two characters to play as. You control one of these at a time, with your AI companion following along in a surprisingly competent manner. However, they will stop following you at times, largely when you activate one of the game's special traversal moves. This results in some very light Lost Vikings-esque gameplay, but it's not like Ed, Edd and Eddy Jawbreakers, where you're completing large stretches of levels multiple times with different characters. The forced separation always ends quickly, and you simply walk past the AI character to get them to rejoin you. But it doesn't always work that well in practice. Getting the characters to rejoin you is super janky, and for something that is so basic, you'll spend way too much time fiddling with it. The goal of each level is to destroy 3 interdimensional portals, and then collect 4 nanochips, which will unlock an end of level portal. Controls are kept pretty simple. A jumps, B attacks, L switches to your secondary character, and then R activates your character's special traversal move. Most characters shoot a projectile as their standard attack, but they each have enough difference so it doesn't feel like they're all the same character. Danny has the strongest in terms of power, Jimmy's will freeze enemies in place, while SpongeBob has the weakest attack. Timmy, on the other hand, gets an entirely different attack. It's a sort of magical explosion that is only effective at really close range. It can be tricky to line this one up, but when you do, it absolutely shreds enemies. The special traversal moves are really where most of the gameplay lies though. Levels are entirely built around using specific traversal powers to get into hard to reach areas. It's an absolute requirement to use certain characters for certain puzzles, which means Climax gives you the ability to change characters during levels. These teleporters are scattered throughout, generally popping up exactly when you need them. The traversal abilities are limited, so you can't just use them non-stop, forcing you to collect these character-specific power-ups to refill your meter. The meter does automatically refill to the halfway point at all times though, so the power-ups aren't always necessary. Instead, they basically act as a cue for realizing it's time to change characters. When you see the Danny power-ups change into SpongeBob power-ups, there's your solution to the next puzzle. So anytime you see a transporter or a change in power-ups, you're going to be switching characters, and this really eliminates a lot of the puzzle solving. Jimmy and Timmy share the exact same power of being able to jetpack up into high spots, or in Timmy's case, you balloon up into the high spots. Danny can go invisible to sneak past certain walls, and SpongeBob will squeeze into tight spaces. The entire game is about you entering a level, fighting off the occasional enemy, selecting the right character to get to a transporter or nanochip, or just to move forward in the level, and then you repeat that for a couple of hours. It's a decent at best experience. Some of the level design does get pretty clever, and the puzzle solving can be fun when Climax doesn't completely telegraph which character is required next. But it's nothing special, and it also has its sore spots. You've got those typical frustrating moments in games like this where you get to the end of a level and then you realize you've missed one of the required items. Backtracking and scouring every inch of a level for a nanochip is just never going to be fun. There's also no difficulty to speak of here. Sure, you will die at points, but there's no repercussions at all. Combine it with every puzzle solution being spoon-fed to you, and you pretty much end up sleepwalking through Nicktoons Unite. The game is split up into 3 levels for each show. The first 2 are your standard gameplay that I've described, while the last level isn't really a level, it's just basically a boss battle against the corresponding show's villain. Again, these are insanely easy, but on a more positive note, the music is pretty good here, and I particularly like this Fairly Odd Parents inspired tune. Nicktoons Unite DS has twice the screens, but will it be twice the fun? So yeah, as expected, the DS version kicks off with the same story as the GBA game, and you basically get the same opening cinematic. It's actually impressive how poor this looks. All the different art styles being brought together here and just sort of mushed up is so distracting. But when you jump out of that inconsequential cutscene, the game looks pretty damn nice for a 3D game on the DS. Characters look solid and the environments are impressive in terms of size and their appearance. Maybe it's because I just didn't see a whole lot of 3D DS games when I was growing up, but I'm always impressed when I see something like this running on a DS. As you can tell, we've got a 3D platformer here that is pretty similar to the GBA version with emphasis on the combat and puzzle solving, but with a way bigger emphasis on actual platforming too. With the addition of the touchscreen and some extra face buttons, Climax was able to get a little deeper with the mechanics in this one. A is the attack button and X is your jump. Climax surprisingly built a lot of this game around the characters having unique traversal options. Characters always have something special happen when you double tap X, rather than just handing out a generic double jump. Jimmy gets a little jetpack boost, which is essentially a double jump, but SpongeBob will glide and Danny can wall jump. It's things like this that make Nicktoons Unite on DS kind of endearing. Like, Timmy actually doesn't get an attack here. Instead, pressing the attack button makes him hide in a shrub, so he's mainly used for stealth. The dedicated Timmy sneaking levels are pretty crap, but even so, I like that Climax didn't just slap everybody with the same abilities and call it a day. This level of experimentation leads to some weird control quirks, like why making you walk slowly. Having beaten the game, I've still got no idea why anybody would use this, but hey, it's here. Breaking out your stylus gives you access to a couple more things, the first of which is character selection. Here you'll be controlling a single character at a time, but whenever you want to, you can drag a different character to the center of the touchscreen and you instantly change. I really do mean instantly too. Swapping characters is so seamless and it goes a long way to making the gameplay feel smooth. A version of this game where switching characters holds everything up for a second or two would be significantly worse. Each character also gets their own health bar, so don't expect to be failing levels too often. The other common use of the touchscreen is to activate your special moves, but rather than being a collection of super mega ultra attacks, these specials are all focused on traversal in one way or another. SpongeBob can float upwards in a bubble, Danny will phase through certain walls, Jimmy gets an extended use of the jetpack, and then Timmy gets a sprint. As a side note, you do actually get a super mega ultra attack that is activated via the touchscreen, but the power-ups to activate these are uncommon, and they honestly aren't that cool. I really prefer the way you utilize each character's powers in this version. The different abilities mesh well, and the different types of traversal lead to some fun level design. But one of the big issues with Nicktoons Unite is that character balance is way off. I spent the majority of the game using Jimmy and Danny because their attacks and abilities were by far the most useful. Poor Timmy, on the other hand, was almost never used except for when his sprint or stealth abilities were explicitly required, which was almost never. Just like the GBA version, beating levels will require you to collect certain amounts of items, and you'll also have to destroy portals. This time, levels are a pretty linear experience, so you can't really miss any of the items unless you're doing some sort of insane challenge run where you're playing the game blindfolded. The whole gameplay experience is very much like Tak the Great Juju Challenge on DS. This feels like a PS1 game that somehow happened to stumble out in 2005. And those PS1 sensibilities are never felt more strongly than when you're fighting the camera for control. Climax gives you the option to center the camera behind you at any time by pressing B, which works perfectly. The big issue is that Climax also starts auto-adjusting the camera for you. It's not even helpful in the slightest the majority of the time. If camera control had just been left up to the player to press B and get the camera back behind you, I honestly think it would have been fine. And a fair warning to anybody attempting to play this game after watching this video, the tutorial level is arguably the worst in the game. It feels like none of the mechanics mesh well here, and I'd say the way Climax teaches the player how to use the tools at their disposal is very poor. To me, it felt like the game got significantly better once I left this level. The rest of the game is a decent mixture of combat, platforming, and traversal puzzle solving. A lot of the game does feel very copy-paste though. Levels tend to follow a very strict structure to the point where it feels like you're just repeating the same levels with a different skin. And we've got to talk about the genuine puzzle sections too. It's basically tradition for licensed games on the DS to just go balls to the wall and dump a million different touchscreen gimmick ideas in to make the player miserable. Tak the Great Juju Challenge was notorious for this. The most commonly occurring minigame here is the hacking puzzle, where you're supposed to match up the same shapes or something. Never once did I feel like I fully understood this one. Tapping on the same shapes would work sometimes, other times it just wouldn't. Most times I'd just fall ass backwards through these sections. At sporadic points, the game will stop and force a minigame onto you, oftentimes replacing actual fights with the villains here. You've got flicking, tapping, and circling like you're playing Pokemon Ranger to absolutely bore you to tears. And if you're a real masochist, there's an arcade machine in the hub area where you can replay these minigames for fun. Don't think the boss battles come out of this review unscathed either. Special shout out to the Vlad Plasmus boss battle. It's one of those pretty standard fights where the boss spawns a bunch of clones and you have to identify the real one to actually deal damage. Generally, the rule is that the OG boss has some sort of giveaway so you know it's them. Instead, Nicktoons Unite has none of that, so you just fire around blindly. And then the Plankton boss battle is next level tedious. The awkward combo of Timmy and SpongeBob's traversal powers combined with how long it takes to chip away at Plankton's health honestly had me considering whether I wanted to keep playing. But one thing always kept me going here no matter how bad things got: the soundtrack. Nicktoons Unite on DS has an OST that slaps, bangs, fucks, shits and comes. The music is credited to Matthew Simmons, who has had a long career stretching back to 1990, but I can't really find many notable games in his work history other than Silent Hill Shattered Memories. He also didn't return for any of the sequels as Japanese developer Natsume took control of the following 3 DS games. But seriously, from top to bottom, the songs in this game are so damn good. One of my favourites was this track from the Vlad's Castle level. I got some major Animal Crossing vibes from this SpongeBob one too. The soundtrack is the one area where Nicktoons Unite is faultless. The rest of the game is a bit of a flawed gem. I really do love the way it brings together the different abilities of each character, but there are just so many issues here that drag it down. It's glaringly obvious that it was made on a budget and under massive time pressure, which leads to big portions of the game feeling like it was copy and pasted. I wouldn't say to stay away from this one if you're a big Nick fan, because there's a lot of stuff to enjoy, but just go in with massively adjusted expectations. We've gradually built in quality from the GBA version of Nicktoons Unite to the DS version. I'm holding out hope that the biggest leap yet is going to come for the home console version. The multiverse has been ripped apart yet again, but this time on a more powerful platform. This is what you were all waiting for. Nicktoons Unite was serviceable on both of the handhelds, but it's the PS2 and GameCube versions that were the holy grail growing up. And just as I expected, the story is essentially the exact same thing here, except expanded upon in much greater depth. The slightly more cinematic feel is immediately on show in the opening cutscene. Instead of being immediately hit in the face with Calamitous bringing together all of the villains, you see Plankton taking over Bikini Bottom before Goddard shows up like he's Nick Fury or something. For all you voice acting aficionados, you'll be pleased to see that this game has brought all of the iconic voices in to give life to the story, and they really don't skimp on it. These unique character interactions you won't find anywhere else are basically the whole appeal of Nicktoons Unite, and it's a relief that Blue Tongue managed to nail this. Story moments are far more rewarding here than in the GBA and DS versions, so even if you're not digging the gameplay, die-hard Nick fans will probably still want to play it through to the very end. It really feels like Blue Tongue wanted to please fans here. You see so many side characters from shows pop up for a brief moment or two, and it's filled with enough references that make me believe a lot of people on the dev team were either Nicktoon fans, or they went out of their way to immerse themselves in the source material.
Hi, Kevin.
Little touches like Cindy making a small reference to the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour when she sees Timmy take this from being just a game featuring Nicktoons to being a genuine Nicktoons game.
Hi, Cindy. Oh, hi, Timmy. I didn't know you were back in Retroville.
And I think this caring touch extends over to the character models. It's such a tough task bringing together characters from shows with different art styles, especially when most of those shows are 2D. Jimmy should naturally fit well here, although Globs of Doom's cutscenes show that it can still be fucked up, and you've still got to take Butch Hartman's style and SpongeBob style and translate those into 3D. Blue Tongue did a really good job, and when you give those models a little extra juice and bump them up to 1080p, they really shine. Hell, compare SpongeBob or Danny to their most recent Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl counterparts, and they hold up surprisingly well. Danny does run kinda weird though, like he's got a stick stuck up his ass or something, so it's not perfect. And then Blue Tongue bust out puddles with actual reflections in them, which blew me away. Maybe my video game development ignorance is shining through here, but this isn't something I was expecting to see in a licensed PS2 or GameCube game. Reflections are notoriously hard to get right in games. I've got to give a special shout out to the soundtrack as well. They did a great job of both capturing the feel of each show with some of the tracks, while also sprinkling in some more cinematic moments that make this feel like a grand adventure. It gets weirdly beautiful at times in the SpongeBob levels. Some of these songs made me feel like I was playing Ni no Kuni or something. So Blue Tongue has ticked a couple of crucial boxes when it comes to the story and presentation, but for Nicktoons Unite to be a truly great experience, the gameplay has to be up to par too. And the kind of game we have here is pretty unique for Nickelodeon. Nicktoons Unite feels like it was massively inspired by X-Men Legends, which had released the year prior. I actually haven't played either of the X-Men Legends games or the Marvel Ultimate Alliance series that spawned out of those, but from what I've seen, it feels like it was the inspiration for Unite. These games are referred to as action RPGs on Wikipedia, which feels like such a nebulous and unhelpful description. In my experience, Unite is a kind of 3D beat 'em up. You basically go from room to room clearing enemies, but then you also have a greater emphasis on traversal and puzzle solving that you wouldn't really see in a traditional 2D beat 'em up. Each character has a standard attack, a ground pound to stun enemies, and a shield to block incoming attacks. Everybody also gets special moves which are tied to the purple meter you'll see at the top of the screen. One of the big problems I quickly encountered here is that the 4 characters are not nearly different enough for a game like this. Something like X-Men Legends or Marvel Ultimate Alliance works because most of the heroes have such distinct abilities. It's super obvious what sets apart characters like Wolverine, Storm, and Cyclops. But most of the Nicktoons cast here aren't natural fighters, and that's kind of where the problems start. Basically, 2 of the characters are ranged attackers here and 2 are melee. Timmy and Jimmy are the ranged attackers, and the devs kind of tried to make them different. Jimmy's airgun thing is akin to a shotgun, mostly effective at close range. Timmy on the other hand is able to fire much more quickly and hit targets from a distance. But Timmy is clearly the better option to use because every character's firepower is the same. Well, at least it felt like they were to me. Timmy can shoot quicker and from further distances, so why wouldn't I just use him? Jimmy seems like he'd be a good option for close quarters crowd control, especially later on when all of your characters get charge attacks, but this neglects the fact that every enemy encounter you have starts with you running in from a distance. There's not much point to a shotgun character if I'm able to pick off enemies from a distance with Timmy before I even get close enough to be effective with Jimmy. The same thing extends to Danny and SpongeBob, who are both melee characters. Again, they both appear to do the exact same amount of damage, but SpongeBob's combat feels way more fluid than Danny's. I'm really not being given any incentive to use Danny here. And Blue Tongue really missed the mark with melee combat in general. It's so unsatisfying to use. It lacks that real crunch and impact here, so fights feel unspectacular. It's like there's no weight behind any of your attacks. Characters start to diverge a bit from their standard archetype as you gather new abilities that the game gives to specific characters at certain spots. These can be used in combat situations, but are often cumbersome and you'll probably just utilize them for their puzzle solving and traversal aspects. But it's here that the characters are really made to feel like themselves and unique. Danny gets the overshadow ability to take over the body of a stunned enemy, he gets the ghostly wail, and he can phase through certain walls. Jimmy gets a gadget to shrink objects and enemies, Timmy switches into his cleft alter ego, which makes him the game's 3rd melee character technically, as well as getting a freeze gun and the ability to heal the team. And SpongeBob gets a bubble bomb alongside using Doodlebob to lure enemies and being able to suck up and spray water. While there's not a whole lot of incentive to switch away from using the game's best characters when purely looking at the combat, Blue Tongue does a great job of forcing you to switch because of these abilities. The gameplay is so heavily focused on combining all of these abilities to keep moving forward that you just naturally start playing as everybody. So while it's not perfect, you will spend a decent amount of time playing as every character. And the game has got a surprising amount of depth to it. You've got an upgrade system here which allows you to upgrade the attack and special abilities of each character. Upgrades always bring a new wrinkle, so it feels like the gameplay is constantly evolving. It does help remove the typical monotony that tends to set in with a beat 'em up style game. To upgrade characters, you collect NRG tokens that are scattered around levels, and they get dropped by defeated enemies or destroyed objects. It's the only Nickelodeon game I'm aware of that rewards you for defiling graves. Unless you're extremely thorough with your collecting, you won't have upgraded every character completely by the end of the game, so a little bit of strategy seeps in here. Although you're probably going to favour upgrades for SpongeBob and Timmy if you're anything like me. Naturally, each section of the game is concluded via a boss battle with one of the bad guys from the shows represented here. The ideas behind these boss battles aren't necessarily bad, but they suffer the same issue as the DS's Plankton fight. They are all so ridiculously long. It's gotta be the most annoying set of boss battles I've ever encountered. Generally, they all follow the format of having to disable some sort of shield or armor before being able to damage the boss, but it takes so long to do it. The worst of these is the Crocker boss battle. It felt like the game was tempting me to turn it off and never return with how tedious it was. You always only have a brief window to chip away at the health before the shield returns, and it ends up taking forever. particularly because your AI teammates are useless. This is a pretty big aspect of the game that I haven't touched on yet. All 4 characters are running around at once, so unless you have some friends on standby, you're going to be accompanied by 3 of the laziest AI characters ever. When you first start playing, you'd be forgiven for thinking the AI characters just don't do anything other than follow you, kind of like the GBA game. In reality, they do help out with combat, but they do the bare minimum. They'll fire off a couple of shots here and there, but most of the time it feels like they're just standing around, and they're certainly not going to use any of their special abilities. Their lack of help becomes really evident in all of the boss battles. You'll deactivate the shield or whatever and go in for the kill, only for your teammates to stand around and be absolutely no help, or at best they'll fire off 1 or 2 shots. It's just insulting. Why even bother to have all of the characters on screen at once if they're not going to do anything? It's a big ask playing this game almost 20 years after release, but play with a friend or 2 if you can. The experience is going to be significantly improved if you do.
Receiving incoming transmission.
Target line.
Your enjoyment of Nicktoons Unite on home consoles is largely going to come down to how much you get excited by seeing these 4 shows cross over. The gameplay isn't awful, but it's definitely not the draw card here. I give them props for doing something unique with it, but there are too many flaws. If this wasn't a Nicktoons crossover game, I'd be far more negative. But it shines in just enough areas that I have hope for the future of this series. Blue Tongue was allowed to return and develop Battle for Volcano Island and Attack of the Toybots before being replaced for Globs of Doom. I really hope that continuity means they can hone and fine-tune the formula. When looked at in the context of being the first game in a trilogy from Blue Tongue, I'm hopeful for the direction of this series. Next time, we'll be jumping back to Cartoon Network Video Game History for the first time since Ben 10 Power Trip to check out the highly anticipated multiverses. While not strictly a Cartoon Network game, WB are relying heavily on the Cartoon Network brand to push this game. The base roster technically only features 4 genuine Cartoon Network characters, but 14 of the 16 characters included at launch have some sort of tie to Cartoon Network, and most of the leaked upcoming characters have ties to Cartoon Network too. It's probably the closest thing we'll ever get to a genuine Punch Time Explosion sequel, so I'm fully embracing it. It's an insane time to be a fan of cartoons and video games, with Nickelodeon Kart Racers 3 also being announced for later this year. Here's hoping multiverses can live up to the hype. To make sure you don't miss that video or any of my upcoming reviews, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And to stay up to date with everything that's happening with the channel, jump over to Twitter and give me a follow.